is. So this is going to be pretty quick. This is my signature assessment or work, my project for my class EDOL 647, dealing with PLCs. Tonight, the agenda is kind of just to talk about my vision statement for like what I see our school and how we're going to work together in our PLCs. A problem that I identified in my class, a strategy that I found to kind of work out that problem, some articles I found to support the information that I'm presenting to you all, how I implemented that strategy, the results of that work, and some next steps for all of us in this PLC. So my personal vision statement is kind of simple. Wallens Elementary School will be a facility where all students will be provided an education individualized to their learning needs. We'll meet students where they are, no matter their circumstance. We'll work together to create PLCs and use them to determine the best instructional practices through the analysis of meaningful data collected in our individual classrooms. We'll be responsive to each student and his or her learning needs through research, positive and constructive conversations, and collaboration among staff and administration as well as other stakeholders like district personnel, family members, guardians, and counselors, and so on. So for this PLC project, there's two parts. The first part that I kind of had to do was identify a problem within my own classroom. I had to research and find a strategy to implement for that problem. I had to plan how that strategy was going to be used and find some articles to back up why that strategy was important or why I should be using it. And then part two, kind of talked about the intervention, talked about how I implemented it, some changes that happened after I implemented it, and then just really looked at the results and analyzed those results to see if that intervention, that strategy was actually worth the time that I used or spent on it. And just reflecting on how this can help us in a PLC in the future. So let's take a moment to jot down a few questions that you've asked your students today or this week. Make sure they're content related questions, not your usual questions like that you get asked 1,000 times during the day. Some examples from my own classroom in this unit of study that I've asked is, what did Ghana trade for goods from other countries around the year 700? How did Mansa Musa strengthen Mali's ties with the Muslim world? And aside from trade, what impact did the Silk Road have on the world? So if you all want to take a couple of minutes to jot down maybe a question or two from your own content area. Anybody got one they want to share?
What is point of view?
Okay, so point of view, what is it? I know that's one of my favorite things to cover in reading. Anybody else got another one?
What's a topic sentence?
Okay, topic sentence. Anybody else?
What is an ecosystem?
Okay, ecosystems, what are they?
What are the elements of art?
Elements of art. Okay, all of those are good examples, things that we talk about in our classrooms and content areas. Looking at my examples, I've given you three. I did that for a reason. Which of the questions in that list do you think is like a more important or meaningful question? If you look at them.
What did the Silk Road impact did it have on the world?
Yeah, so that's exactly right. That's the answer I wanted you to find. So what impact did the Silk Road have on the world? That is a more meaningful question because it, asks a broader thinking for the students. Like they have to really think about, well, what they know about the Silk Road, but not just factual knowledge about the Silk Road, like, hey, it went from this part of Asia to this part of Asia. They actually have to know what kind of impact that specific, series of trade routes had on the rest of the world at that time period. Good. So that brings me to the problem that I was seeing in my own classroom. Because I teach a discipline area, which is social studies this year, it's my first year in social studies, I constantly find myself asking students, factual information like, well, what is what are the three kingdoms of West Africa? Who's Mansa Musa? All these are just coming from this last content that we went over. But constantly asking those factual questions, they're in the textbook, they're questions that I have to ask them in order to really understand, that they're getting the content. But I kind of stray away from those larger questions and neglect to ask those more in-depth questions that, call on them to connect their thinking and really grow their comprehension of the subject or topic at large. We as teachers spend a lot of time asking those lower level questions like what is point of view or what is an ecosystem, because they have to know that information. But we can't just spend all of our time on the facts and definitions and vocabulary and things without really thinking about those higher order questions, because they have to be able to do this higher order thinking on their own, especially on, I wrote, the high stakes assessments like the K-Prep. They're not going to get any help from us when it comes to assessments like that. So they have to be able to do some of these larger or more in-depth thinking on their own, and we've got to prepare them for that in our own classrooms. Okay, so the strategy, obviously, I've mentioned it. Higher order thinking. I thought, how can I target or ask those more in-depth, bigger idea questions in my own classroom throughout my unit of study and really make my students understand those larger connections. Accompanying high order thinking with proficiency and comprehension, I think it should be the goal of every teacher in every grade level and discipline. We want our kids to make those larger connections between those ideas and concepts rather than just memorizing facts. So what is high order thinking? This is a type of thinking that goes beyond memorizing facts and telling word for word, regurgitating information back to the teacher. It's connecting those ideas, making connections between them, predicting things, inferring things before you've read, after you've read, manipulating facts, being able to work with the knowledge that you have and applying that knowledge in some way. So how do we achieve that in our classrooms? What do we have to do to be able to get them to think like this? Well, we as educators have to develop questions, obviously, and activities that cause our students to work on those types of skills like inferencing, problem solving, brainstorming, and critical thinking. That's our job. We've got to come up with ideas and questions to do that. So, in order to address the need for higher order thinking, I set out to develop these type of what I read and researched what they call hot questions or higher order thinking questions. And target those comprehension questions before and during my instruction. I sat down with the standards, obviously, I sat down with the textbook, and I looked at the things that I could connect with the standards, things that they really needed to know. I wanted to think about the overarching goal of the whole entire, chapter, rather than just like, what do they have to know out of this lesson? So, previous chapters, my first, and you'll see some of the information like this later on, but in my first chapter assessment, the kids, like the class average itself was a 77%. Like I had 6 kids that failed the test, and the majority of the kids scored like B's, with only 1 kid making an A at all. So it was like a turning point. I was like, oh my gosh, I've got to do something, so what can I do? They didn't do well on written questions like this one's an example. Some scholars think early peoples came to North America on foot. Others believe they came by boat. Still others think that both theories are true. Which theory do you think is most reasonable and why? So this is a higher order thinking question, because not only do they have to decide what they believe and remember all those facts that they learned about, migration to North America, but they have to support that with knowledge that they have about why they think this is the most reasonable explanation. They struggle to answer that. They can normally give their opinion about which one, but like I said, they have trouble connecting all those facts that they memorized with that larger idea. Well, why is this the best answer? So I found a couple of articles that talked about higher order thinking. This first book is called Literacy Strategies for Grades 4 through 12, Reinforcing the Threads of Reading. In chapter 5 of this book, the author kind of talks about higher order thinking within the classroom and really focuses on Bloom's taxonomy verbs. We hear that all the time. We use those all the time in our lesson plans, and but she really talked about those verbs and the shift in focus. There was a quote that she said in one part of this chapter, that students can only do well on the test when they're accustomed to providing on a regular basis the types of responses the test demand. We cannot and should not try to prep students. We've got to teach them how to think. So we can't just literally well, this is going to be on the test, so you got to be able to answer this question. It has to be, you don't just prep them for that test. You've got to, ask those type of questions beforehand, expecting them to be able to do that on their own later on. In this book by Susan Brookhart, she talks about how we're thinking and those skills as they apply to different topics like knowledge, critical thinking, and problem solving. She actually, in her book, it was a study from a couple of other different people that put it into another article, but they did this study about how we're thinking and did a project with a 5th grade social studies class, so I was interested in this because, of course, I'm a 5th grade social studies class. This 14-week project where they were gauging the students' participation during this unit of study, and at the beginning, about 20% of the time, students were inactive or just off task. Less than half of them agreed that they were excited about this topic. But by the end of this research project where they had worked on higher order thinking skills and activities, 95% agreed that they were excited about their learning, and 89% of that social studies assignment was easy to them. So a huge, huge difference after that 14 weeks of really working on higher order thinking skills. Okay, so round 1 of working with the strategy in my own classroom. The students, like I said, were having hard times making those larger connections. Obviously, from that first chapter's data, like after that assessment, I was like, but I started working on asking those higher order thinking questions in the 2nd chapter. When we started talking about Native Americans and different Native American groups, I really started asking them those hot questions throughout the unit of study, not just towards the end. And comparing the two, at class averages, it was a huge difference. The class went from a 77% at the first chapter assessment to a 92% with the 2nd assessment. So that was a huge and undeniable improvement. We went from a D to a B. So I was extremely pleased with that. But I wanted to make sure that I tried this again, so I changed some things up. I recognized, I was excited about that score, but I also recognized that we literally spent a week per lesson in that chapter talking about that particular Native American group and diving into extra research because they had a separate project that they worked on with their Native American shelters. So we spent extra time going over websites and taking notes off that. So I know that the kids got bombarded with lots and lots of information, and they knew it probably better than they did even the first chapter that they took that assessment on, combined with the hot questions I was asking them. So I wanted to kind of reduce the time that I spent in this 3rd chapter that we started to kind of level it out with the way the first chapter was. I also found, I thought they were very interested in that 2nd chapter, so interest was a factor. They were excited about that because they knew they were getting ready to do those projects, and of course they get kind of excited about that. Plus, I also gave them a lot of bonus questions for that chapter because we spent so much time reading out of the textbook, plus working on the website. I took facts from the website that they had taken notes on and used them as bonus questions. So I didn't want to just fluff the score just because they had extra bonus questions. So I wanted to kind of change that up for the 3rd assessment. So, like I said, in order to prevent all that from happening, I changed up this. I spent the majority of the chapter talking with students about those overarching connections with chapter 3. Spent less time than the 2nd chapter, and students were asked those questions throughout each lesson. There were 3 lessons in this chapter. So I asked them those questions as we progressed on a constant basis. So even shortening that chapter of study down, but because I kept asking them those larger questions and having those do activities to make those connections, you can see that the hot questions improved, it even improved further than the second chapter assessment, if you look at that. So after chapter 1, 19 students had taken the assessment before the strategy was implemented, and they had a 77% average. 2 students made below a D, 5 failed, majority of them making Bs. With the chapter 3 assessment, which was about the same length as the first one, with those that strategy being implemented, the class had an average of 94%. So I was, flabbergasted and elated at the same time. No Ds or Fs were made on this assessment. There were only 3 Cs. There were only 17 students because 2 of them were absent, but still, that averages out. It's still a huge, huge improvement. This is a comparison of, I picked out 4 students to just kind of compare their scores of all 3 assessments and put it into a bar graph. And you can look at this. So the gray is the first test, the blue is the second test, the green is the last test that they just took after that strategy was implemented. Of course, the gray, none of those hot questions were really implemented in a orderly kind of way or intentional way in the lesson. But with the exception of this student 4, every single student improved their grade on that third, just kept improving as those hot questions were being asked in a more intentional way throughout the lesson. But still, student 4 still passed, which I'd like to point that out. Alright, so reflecting on the next steps. Because this effort was so successful with the students, I'm going to continue to learn and continue to use these hot questions throughout the lesson, because obviously me just asking them facts and expecting them to be able to answer these short answer questions, it's not going to work. That was my fault to begin with. But asking these hot questions in an intentional way is what I'm going to continue to do. I want to try to research more strategies other than just directly asking them those questions during like conversations or discussions in class. Maybe find some group work opportunities, like where they have to work together and talk to one another. Because I do a lot of talking in my class. It's more like a lecture for the most part, and then asking them. So I'd like for it to become more student-led, and if they can work together on these questions and really talk amongst one another about them, I think that would be a good thing. Maybe even, them coming up eventually with their own hot questions. Me kind of modeling that, like what's the difference between, a lower level thinking question and a higher level thinking question. And if they're asking the questions, they're literally coming up with this from their own knowledge and their own experience, and I think that's something that we really want them to push towards. So with your little sheet of paper that you got, I want you to kind of think about the same questions that you just had, but try and turn those into a hot question or a big idea instead of that factual, because most of you all, I think all of you all, had questions at the beginning that were factual, like, can you tell me what this is, right? There were what questions. When you're thinking of hot questions, you're thinking about those why questions. Why is this important? Why is it useful? You've got to think about it and turn those questions into hot questions. So I'll give you a few seconds, or a few minutes to kind of do that, and then I'll just kind of walk around if you're stuck. So just take the first question you had and turn it into a hot question. Maybe, why do we use the elements of art? Or like, why are the elements of art important in analyzing an artwork? Maybe instead of saying why. So she's got why is point of view, because her first question was what is point of view. She's got why is point of view important. I was thinking maybe instead of just like why is it important, why is it important to know the point of view in a story? Because students have to know, they just don't have to identify the point of view. They have to know why it's important. Like, I need to know who's talking to me, who's telling me this story, what their point of view is, where they're coming from in that kind of story or whatever you're reading. So what is an ecosystem? So you but why is it important to understand ecosystems? Science questions are hard. So why are ecosystems important? Why should we be concerned with ecosystems? Because, some conversations you can have in science often, lend themselves to bigger questions like, well, why should we care, right? What do you got? Okay, so what's a topic sentence? Why is it necessary to know what a topic sentence is? Yeah, okay, so how do we apply a topic sentence? Why do we have to have a topic sentence? Obviously, to let our readers know clearly what we're asking. Yeah, all of those are good questions, guys. So thinking ahead to maybe our next meeting, so we all understand that we need to work in PLCs. That's a problem that we have in this school in general. We've tried starting to implement those PLCs, and this is a good way for us to get together and actually talk about things that are going on in our own classrooms. So I want you to kind of go away from this meeting brainstorming some things that's going on in your own classroom. Maybe an issue that you're facing, like a particular content area. Once you've identified that issue, maybe we can all email one another as a group, and we can pick, like, if something's going on in your classroom and it's, I don't know, maybe it's something to do with comprehension or a particular, like, strategy you're using. Maybe we can find that as a common factor between all of our classes, because we do use a lot of the same strategies. We can focus on getting some data in each of our classrooms with that, and then we can come back to the next meeting prepared to discuss a strategy and how to target that issue together again. Because, I've given you this example that you can take back and maybe even use in your own classrooms, like changing up the way you question your students. I kind of came up with a timeline, if you all are okay with it, January the 10th, that we can have, because December is crazy, and I know it's early on in December, but, it's kind of hard to get all of this stuff done with the Christmas program and all that stuff. But by January 10th, we have identified a problem area in our own classrooms. We've emailed each other, we've talked about it, we've decided it, and we've started to kind of gather some of our own evidence or data in our classrooms. And then by the 31st, of the end of the month, we'll meet again to discuss those strategies that we found to work on that one problem. So we can share those strategies out in our group and maybe even begin using those, to prepare or kind of help our students.